Basic appraisal procedures, page 148. This may contribute to a higher selling price. Both the buyer's and the seller's actions and motivations must be considered in the transaction. A competent appraiser must consider all aspects of the transaction. The objective is to determine what a typical buyer and a typical seller would do in a typical transaction. If a determination cannot be made by the appraiser that a comparable sale was indeed an arm's length transaction, the appraiser should discard it as a potential comparable sale. Furthermore, if the subject property is not part of an arm's length transaction, the appraiser must discuss this in the appraisal report, along with its effect, if any, on the final opinion of value presented in the report. Case study number 4.3. Property sells for less than market value. A listed single-family dwelling sells for what will later be determined as less than market value, and the appraiser must deduce why this is the case. Appraiser Jack Swift is considering a comparable property for an assignment for which he is gathering market data. This particular comparable property transferred 2 weeks ago for $450,000. The property has been listed for $495,000 with a broker and had been on the market for approximately 80 days. This typical days on market, DOM, for the subject's area is about 90. Point break. According to this information, does this sale appear to represent an arm's length transaction? Appraiser Swift recalled a conversation he had with the seller of the property several weeks ago when verifying the listing for a relocation assignment. The seller, who was also the listing agent and one of the area's top producing agents, had told Jack she would not consider selling the property for less than $470,000. She was in the process of building a new house and in no particular hurry to sell, since the new house wouldn't be finished for several months. The seller further stated if she could not obtain her price, she would keep the house and rent it out, as similar properties were renting for about $3,000 per month in the area. Appraiser Swift contacts the agent to verify the terms of the sale. Point break. What information is Appraiser Swift looking for? When asked, the seller relates the details of the transaction to Appraiser Swift. The buyer was in a unique circumstance, relocating with an employer, but with temporary housing provided, meaning immediate possession was not necessary. The buyer made the offer of $450,000 with transaction possession terms allowing the seller to remain in the house for 5 months, which was about when the seller's new house would be completed. The seller also found this term to be attractive because it meant she and her family would not need to move twice at an estimated cost of $5,000. Page 149. Case study 4.3 continued. Point break. Can this transaction be utilized as an arm's length transaction? How would the concessions be quantified? The single family dwelling sold for less than market value due to buyer concessions. Therefore, this transaction is not an arm's length transaction. The circumstances are far from typical. It can be inferred from the narrative the seller agreed to a much lower price because the buyer allowed the seller to remain in the home for the period needed until the new home was completed. The concessions could be quantified by considering the saved expense from moving only once instead of twice. Additional adjustments may also need to be made for the rental value of the property. During the 5 months, the seller is allowed to remain in the house rent-free. Important points. Both the seller and the buyer's motivations and actions must be considered when determining whether a transaction was arm's length. If a comparable cannot be determined as an arm's length transaction, it must be discarded as a possible comparable. If the subject itself is not an arm's length transaction, it must be discussed in the appraisal report, along with its effect, if any, on the final opinion of value presented in the report. Application of zoning issues. Even when dealing with residential property, there are zoning issues that must be considered. Zoning laws do more than simply state the type of building or activity permitted on the property. There are usually setback and side yard rules dictating how and where the building may be placed, as well as rules for building size, building use, and other requirements. Residential properties must conform to these regulations or fall under one of several exemptions. Failure to comply can result in value loss, so the appraiser must be sure to know any zoning issues in the appraisal report, along with any exemptions applicable. Exemptions generally fall into one of 4 categories. Number 1, area variances. Number 2, use variances. Number 3, conditional uses. Number 4, non-conforming uses. The main way zoning law restrictions are relaxed with regard to building size and placement is with variances. Variances are permissions granted by the zoning authority to allow some deviation from strict compliance with zoning laws. Area variances legally permit deviation regarding building size, height, limits, setbacks, side yards, and so on. Use variances permit a property owner to use land in a way that's not allowed in that zone, such as commercial use in a residential zone. Non-conforming uses occur when land use does not conform to current zoning laws, but is allowed because the land use was